Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and our Dina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome, everybody, to Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm Peter Moses with my co-host John Sharan and our Dina Seward. Are you guys ready for the new cold wave coming in, the Arctic blast?
The deep freeze that is going to send new records to places like Des Moines and Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, they're saying Chicago in the middle of the week maybe 25 degrees below zero.
That's the actual temperature. That's without the wind chill. They say with the wind chill, it could be as low as 55 below.
Well, my friend Andy in Montreal said that one day last week that the weather was 40 minus Celsius though. So it's and the roads were completely impassable. The only vehicles that were allowed on the roads were city buses, which you'd think in a hilly place like Montreal would be the last vehicles that should be on the road.
However, remember, they do have weight.
They do.
Right. Well, I suggest that people watch an incredible series on the air. It's called Life Below Zero, and it's all about how to survive in extreme cold. And they have, I think it's 4 or 5 people that they follow on Life Below Zero.
And what channel is this?
Is it on Discovery or something?
Yeah, I get it on I think it's channel 162 on my.
That's Nat Geo.
Optimum.
That's Nat Geo.
I think it's on. It's National Geographic, actually. The National.
Which,
Geographic.
by the way, do you know that channel is owned by Fox?
What, National Geographic?
That's one of the Fox stations. Anyway, we're talking about power, in a sense. You know that we need to have.
We need to be able to stay warm.
Stay warm, and our guest on the show was on here a couple of weeks ago, and this guy is so clued in that in anticipation of his birth, there's a school named for him in the state of California. UCal Berkely was named for this guy.
I hear that.
I mean, Richard, you're a powerful, powerful man. Richard Berkely, a lawyer who's a representative of the Unity Project. Are you with us?
Or Utility Project.
Utility. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Stay on topic.
Let's have
Peter.
Unity on Utility.
Stay on topic.
And I have my glasses on right now. So we're having you on today in part. I mean, again, after a couple of weeks ago, where Con Ed has announced that there's a moratorium now on all these massive expansions that got all these developers want to do in Westchester because they have run out of the ability to give them natural gas. What do you think of that?
So this is good timing, especially since it's getting cold, and Con Edison is saying, "Well, all you people who wanted heat, sorry." But I think actually there are a couple ways to look at this. The first one is that in many ways, the health of Westchester is connected to economic development and to growth. And if you saw the story about Yonkers, Yonkers has had a tremendous amount of economic development in the last decade. They've come a tremendous way, and this is going to stop that progress in Yonkers, and one could say for most of Westchester. So there's a very, strong negative effect on the ground when you talk about a moratorium like this, even if it's temporary, but who knows. But more importantly, why wait until only 2 months before the moratorium to tell people?
Huh.
And that's the part that's much more complicated.
I actually spoke to somebody who's part of a multi-billion-dollar development company in New York City, and they told me that there will be pass-arounds. There'll be ways around for smart developers to get power, and they won't be worrying about it. It's maybe the small to medium-sized projects that have to worry, that do not have the economic reach of large development. Is that true or untrue?
That's hard to say, because all you got so far from Con Edison was essentially a press release and something to the Public Service Commission, the state's utility regulator, saying, we have to do this, now let's talk. So, an answer that says the wealthy developers are fine and the people who are building for the middle class are not, is not the kind of answer that Westchester needs.
That's not what I said. If that's how you took it, that's not how I meant it. I meant it that large developers, the people who are developing massive buildings or building complexes.
A development.
Yeah, large development. And not individual homes. It could be individual homes in a large development, or it could be a hospital built in the woods, like I'm fighting against with one of my clients up in Newcastle. It's different for them, the really deep-pocketed developers. But we're going to be going to break in just a moment because I've been long-winded in my opening with my co-hosts here. And when we get back, we're going to be speaking to Richard Berkely about this in greater detail, because the knee-jerk reaction in the Journal News and in other media was that this is going to put a halt to growth in Westchester County. And Richard seems to support that to some degree. And I think we need to explore that a little bit further. We are Westchester Eye on the radio on WVOX and WVOX.com. We're about to go to a very long Fox business and news break, business news and just regular news break. And we'll be back after these messages. And please stay with us because we have a good show today. And we'd like you to interact and give us a call if you need to. We'll be right back after this.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the Radio here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Sharan along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward. And today we are talking about an issue related to southern Westchester in the extreme, because Con Edison has announced, or at least it announced on January 18th, that beginning on March 15th, the company would take a moratorium on connections for new gas customers in southern Westchester. And that has gotten quite a few local governments upset, local developers upset, that projects that have been in the works may very well come to a screeching halt. And talking about that today is Richard Berkely, a lawyer who's with the New York Utility Project. We had him on talking about utilities a few weeks back, but this is a very timely issue. And Richard, tell us a little bit about how you perceive this. I mean, some people, Peter had brought up the concept that there are some larger developers out there who really believe that they can make arrangements within their own developments to cover these things. And at the same time, there are others who are saying, no, this is going to be something that really brings a hard,
for everybody,
a hard line to everyone. That's exactly right. So what's your view on it, Richard?
So you put your finger exactly on the most important question, which is how are people going to adapt? What are going to be the coping strategies? And speaking as someone who represents low and moderate income residential energy consumers, in the rate case, which Con Edison is going to file this week, this issue is going to be brought up, and all of the stakeholders, and I urge every member of Westchester County who thinks that they have a dog in this hunt to file, all the municipalities, any groups, to come in and become a party in the rate case, because we're going to talk about this issue. Something very similar happened in Tompkins County. There was a gas shortage, and I'm simplifying the question up there, but there was a community stakeholders set of meetings, and they came up with a solution. And one of the solutions that you might see in Westchester is that some of the developers, instead of putting in gas heat, which is what most customers ask for because it's inexpensive and it's relatively clean, the developers will move to geothermal heat pumps or air source heat pumps. And because they run off of electric, they won't be affected by this moratorium. So there will be ways to continue to build. But the question is at what price and what sort of distribution through the county. So the rate case will be one way to deal with this issue, and the other will be for your elected officials, the county executive, and for the leaders of the larger municipalities that are having the largest amounts of growth to get together and decide how are we going to approach this as a county.
Now, Richard,
because as a county, you have to make your needs felt.
Now, Richard, a lot of people are looking at this and they're saying, is this Con Edison fabricating a need, creating a crisis, if you will? Is it a situation where there really is not enough gas, or is it a situation where they as a company do not want to go out of their way to put in the infrastructure that would be necessary to supply these developments?
And that's a very good question, too. And I think if you were to ask some of the environmental groups, they would say they don't want the company to build any more natural gas infrastructure, and that state policy is moving in the opposite direction. We're trying to lower, as a state, our greenhouse gas footprint. We're trying to move to renewables and do less fossil fuels. And so you would hear that kind of argument. I think at the same time, the company's statement that there is a shortage for all practical measures of how to get gas into Westchester is accurate. The questions are really about why did it take them so long to start a public discussion about it, and then what are the reasonable solutions that can be talked about. Now, there are companies in the state that have suggested what they call a virtual pipeline, which is essentially trucking in gas on trailer trucks and injecting it into the system. I don't think anyone in Westchester wants that.
Now, looking at this, through the years, Con Edison has always been very keen to maximize rate increases whenever they could out here. Are they responsible, and should they take responsibility for this? Because certainly they've wanted to give return to their investors and shareholders, but at the same time, don't they have an obligation to their customers?
Well, the company absolutely has a duty to provide what's called safe and adequate service at just and reasonable rates. So they're supposed to know how much gas, how much electric they have to provide to their system and to take steps to make sure it's there. If you ask the company, they would tell you, well, right now the political environment is against us building new pipelines. And the company would love to build new pipelines for a whole bunch of reasons, one of which, as you point out, is they get paid for that. So, they're not deciding not to build pipelines or deciding not to hook up new customers because they're angry at the county. They have a serious problem, and they want to trigger a discussion about it, which is what we're doing right now.
I have a question. New York City has an extra power source that we don't seem to have up here, thermal power. Almost every elevator in New York City is operated via thermal power. And I'm curious why that doesn't, not just for elevator buildings, but I'm sure they could be used for other purposes. Why isn't that happening in other places outside of Manhattan?
So slowly but surely it is. And part of the state's transition towards a much more forward-looking energy policy under Governor Cuomo is to start looking around for using geothermal wherever we can. In the same kind of way that the feds used to say, all of the above is the way we have to get past this moment in time in energy. New York State is doing that, and geo is going to be one of the ways to move forward. Unfortunately, it's very expensive.
And doesn't it really apply more to bigger, taller buildings that can be concentrated where things can come together rather than, a place like Westchester County, more suburban, more spread out, more individual homes?
Well, actually, where you're doing these large developments that we were just talking about a couple minutes ago, you can plan them for geothermal, and it makes a lot of sense to do that.
Okay, now speaking of alternative energy, I have a question about solar power. Apparently, Con Ed some months ago purchased interest in a company called Spectra. They spent $1.4 billion for these solar projects, which are used throughout Arizona, Nebraska, and California, which has made Con Ed allegedly the second largest solar supplier in the country. Now, at the same time, they have also predicted a stock dividend loss of, I think, roughly 0.25 cents in 2019.
And you're going to have to hold that thought till after we get back from a break, Ardina, because you're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Charan, along with Ardina Seward and Peter Moses, and our call-in guest today is Richard Berkely, a lawyer who's with the New York Utility Project, and we're talking about the upcoming proposed moratorium by Con Edison to halt new gas connections here in Lower Westchester. It's something that will affect every community down here, and we'll be back to talk about that and more details after a brief Fox News break, so stay tuned.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Here we are again. We get to do it all over again. Our second half hour of Westchester Eye on the Radio. I am Ardina Seward, seated with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and our guest today is Richard Berkely, who is an attorney with the Utility Power Project, which is a grassroots movement, and they advocate for low-income utility users. And today we are talking about the Con Ed moratorium on gas lines, gas pipes, I should say, on building gas pipes. So before
there's the moratorium on
new lines,
new
construction beginning on March 15th.
Thank you.
And you had some facts that you were going to share with us, Ardina.
And here they go.
That wasn't one of them.
Well, that was one of them. All right. I stand corrected. Now, before the commercial break, we were talking about Con Ed's dropped $1.54 billion on this solar energy company that has projects in Arizona, Nebraska, California, yada, yada, yada. I don't think they have any in New York. But the bottom line is that there is a projection that the company that they have interest in is they have $576 million of existing debt, which means that Con Ed has forecast that there will be a 0.25 drop in shares in 2019, and then there will be a 0.15 drop in shares in 2020. So my question to you, Richard, is in some nuanced way, are the costs of this deficit being passed on to the consumer?
So that's a good question, and they should not be passed on to ratepayers in the state of New York. Con Edison, like many other large utilities, has both a regulated side of the business, which is regulated by New York's Public Service Commission, and an unregulated part of the business. Con Edison, for example, used to have an unregulated energy services business called Con Ed Solutions. So this sort of, maybe it's not fair to call it wildcatting, but this kind of investment in things outside of its core business are the company's attempt to future-proof itself. It sees clearly, like many other utilities, that solar is the wave of the future, at least the near future, and they're trying to invest in it. But in the context of a rate case, and again, I keep mentioning the rate case because this is the moment when Westchester will be able to protect itself from the moratorium and whatever might happen, and from any increases coming from Con Ed's other operation. In the rate case, we'll look at those expenditures, among other things, and say what is reasonable and allowable to be passed on to the ratepayers and what is not.
Yeah, well, I mean, what if Con Ed is not ramping up on solar power in the service area that we're talking about, then why do we have to pay basically a surcharge on their investment, which they are involved in, and and that investment is already $576 million in the hole. You know, how do we work around that?
So the state of New York will intervene in the case. Westchester County has a very good utility lawyer that they work with. We'll be in the case. The city of New York will be in the case, and a bunch of other stakeholders. And again, I argue that all of the municipalities, particularly the ones that are worried about contraction of development, to get involved in the case and make sure. I mean, we get involved in rate cases because we look out for keeping fees like that off of the backs of ratepayers. So I guarantee you that we'll be looking closely at that issue among a whole bunch of others in this rate case. It's going to take us the next year to fight through.
Okay, and I have also another question, which doesn't have anything to do with Con Ed's investment. It has to do more with the politics. Does this boil down to a contest between environmentalists and the utility company? Apparently, Cuomo has supported the environmentalists who do not want more gas pipelines, do not want more digging, do not want gas being transported through their communities. And Con Ed is saying, but we have to have these gas lines so that gas will not be so expensive, so that you can have these buildings. This is something as simple as that.
And you've summarized the argument that's been going on for the last year and a half, 2 years in the state of New York.
Good job,
the environment. Yeah, good one. The environmentalists are saying don't build any more, because if the state is going to do what it says and transition off of fossil fuels, we're going to spend billions across the state on building new fossil fuel infrastructure, and the ratepayers are going to pay for it for the next 30 years, even when we've gone to all renewables. At the same time, there are groups like mine and the state saying natural gas is cheaper, it's safe, it's effective, and we can't just walk away from it, because the people who have trouble paying their bills now are not going to be able to afford to pay the bills if, such as heat pumps come in, which are much more expensive. And you'll see that fight fought out again in this rate case, and Con Edison is the biggest rate case in the state, so it'll be the strongest argument about these issues.
So what's the workaround? In other words, do you at some point something has to give? I mean, it ain't getting any warmer out there, so we have to have heat. But I think my question is there a middle ground between possibly having more pipelines and satisfying environmental concerns also, or the twain will never meet?
And so that is actually a question that we've been debating in New York for the last 4 years, since something called Reforming the Energy Vision started. And let me see if I can summarize thousands upon thousands of pages of testimony and whatnot. But the issue is, how do we move forward and reinvent the electric grid in such a way that, and the energy grid generally, but in such a way that we can continue to grow, but at the same time we can get prices lower and to lower our greenhouse gas footprint. So that's a hard one, and as I said, we've been fighting about it at the state level for years. At a granular level, like what works for Westchester's middle-class families and low-income families and seniors and returning vets, there are people in Westchester who will make a choice to move off of gas to buy heat pumps, and particularly if the company puts a subsidy on that to free up natural gas capacity so that there can be development. That's the sort of approach that they used in Tompkins County when they had this problem last year. And that's one of the things we'll probably talk about in Westchester, which is, are there people who are willing to vote with their values and to move off of natural gas, freeing up more natural gas capacity in their part of the county?
Are there?
Now, is it all just about... I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're mentioning Tompkins County. Are there any cities in Tompkins County of any size? Are there large towns? Because what goes on in a small rural county may not really work in something as variegated as Westchester, which has large cities like Yonkers, Mount Vernon, White Plains, and New Rochelle, and to a lesser extent Peekskill, than might be at Tompkins County. What are the big communities up there? Do you know?
Ithaca is the big community in Tompkins County.
Okay.
And as you point out, it's smaller than most of the large municipalities in Westchester. Speaking as a former resident of Tarrytown, and what we used to call No Tarrytown, but now Sleepy Hollow, Westchester is a very complicated place, and that's why this is not going to be an easy solution. But you have plenty of people in Westchester who care about reducing their greenhouse gas footprint and are willing to pay the extra price for putting in ground source or air source heat pumps to free up some of that gas. Is that going to be the only answer? No. And one of the smartest things that the state's done in the last 5 years is to create a process for things called non-wires alternatives and non-pipe alternatives. And Con Ed is doing something they call the Smart Solutions Docket. And this is to try and figure out ways to not have to build new gas or not have to build new electric, but to continue serving the economic growth we all need.
Well, we're speaking with the representative of the utility project here in New York, Richard Berkely, a lawyer, and you're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Charan, along with Peter Moses and Ardina Seward. We have more conversation about this topic. I'm certainly interested myself in finding out whether Mr. Berkely thinks that Con Edison was willfully ignoring the problem or that they had this by design all along. But we'll find out more about that after we get back from a brief Fox News break.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Charan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to the final 10 minutes here of Westchester Eye on the Radio. I'm John Charan, along with our Dina Seward and Peter Moses. And our on-the-phone guest, our phone-in guest, is Richard Berkely, a lawyer who's with the New York Utility Project. And Richard, getting right down to a simple question. Do you think Con Edison willfully ignored the situation and chose not to pay attention to the direction that growth was going in Westchester because they felt that it was in their financial best interests to do so?
I think I'd have to say no. I think the worst you can say about them is that they waited as long as they could before bringing this issue up because it puts pressure on. Essentially, it's a game of chicken at this point. And, they make money when they build pipelines so that the profit motive works in the opposite direction than you would think in this circumstance. So I don't think they held off for bad reasons and taking action. And there has been some difficulty in building pipelines in the state in recent years, and I think that's affected them too.
And Ardina, we have another guest, so why don't you introduce him?
And speaking of building pipelines, and someone who may be against building the pipelines, we have Ed Berry on the line. Ed Berry is the organizer, I should say, head of I think it's a Hudson Valley section of the Sierra Club. And Ed is an environmentalist. Ed, correct me if I got your title wrong.
Who can remember titles? Now, I'm on the executive board of the Lower Hudson Sierra Club. I'm the political chair is my title. For my sins, I'm the political guy.
So what say you about this whole mess?
Yeah, the thing, it's taking a lot of us by surprise, I suppose. The one thing that I'd like to introduce to the argument, and I thank you very much for having this discussion. It's very topical. It's very much a good topic to have right now. I appreciate Mr. Berkeley's expertise on this matter. I've learned a little bit by listening already. I think what we have to look at is this is an opportunity for change for the future, for a good change. Ms. Berkeley made the point that when you do build these pipelines, you're committing yourself to 40 years or better of using that product, or at least of paying for the construction of those pipelines and compressor stations that you're not going to use, because we're clearly moving away from that. We clearly have to move away from that, so that this is an opportunity to move towards geothermal, towards heat pumps, towards solar, towards a greater dependence on wind. It is a scary time because it's a new concept to most of us. Most of us think, oh well, I get an oil delivery. I can remember 30 years ago switching my dad's house over from dirty oil to clean natural gas. Because it seemed like the thing to do. Now I know more. Now I've learned more. So I look at this as an opportunity for change for the good. I don't want to take up a lot of time. I just wanted to get that in there. And also there is the idea, two other ideas, energy efficiency and demand reduction. For older buildings, there's a lot we can do to increase their energy efficiency. And then there's a lot that we can do in our daily lives to cut down the use of electricity. Not a popular idea, I admit that, but it is a concept that could be used at this time.
And in the
thank you.
I was going to say, in the era of smart houses and smartphones and everything running on electricity, using less electricity doesn't seem to be something that most people want to consider.
Well, thank you, Ed, for calling in. I want to toss it back to Richard. Richard, I know you were talking about heat pumps before. Now, again, correct me if I have my science wrong, but what I've read about heat pumps is that they are efficient only until I think it's 25 degrees. After 25 degrees, then you have to have auxiliary heat to kick in. So everybody's talking about heat pumps, but are heat pumps really the alternative to gas?
So heat pumps have become more efficient than they were in the past, and if you were one of those folks who bought into the heat pumps in the late 70s and the 80s, yeah, they had a problem when it got cold. They were better for other parts of the country, but the newer ones are much more efficient, and they can work down to much colder temperatures. But you're right. At some point, you're switching to also using the pump as a resistance heater, basically like the electric baseboard heat that our parents had when electric was supposed to be too cheap to meter. But even so, I think people who care about the environment would argue that switching to more electric usage, particularly in New York, where our electric is generally generated in a relatively clean way compared to the rest of the country, that's better than just burning natural gas for heat. My organization's focus is on keeping it affordable for low-income, moderate-income, fixed-income. And so that's why we haven't opposed the building of new gas pipelines, even though we do want, and this is our slogan, more green for less green. And that's, I think, something that your listeners would agree with in the end.
But how much can, I know it's hard for you to quantify now, but let's say for a young couple that is buying a house somewhere in the area and they have to run a gas line in, which they may not be able to do at this point, how much more of an investment would they have to anticipate if they're going to buy this house and they have to heat it and they've got to supply energy?
So that's a very good question, and I think part of that will depend upon how we work out any kind of subsidies to try and transition new construction off of the need for a gas hookup to something like geothermal or some other way of getting to that goal. Because heat pumps are expensive, geothermal heat pumps are expensive, but when you plan a development around them, the costs are lower when you buy them in bulk, when you have a subsidy or a certain kind of rate that puts most of the cost of paying for them on the backs of people that use them. You know, all of those models and others are out there to try and make it affordable. Again, my organization is about affordability, so, you know, ask me that question again in a couple of months and I'll have a better answer for you because we'll have crunched the numbers by then.
Now, for activists, politicians, consumers who want to get involved in the argument or the solution, how do they go about doing it? Who do they call? Where do they start? Because as you said before, Con Ed is going to ask for a rate hike coming up soon, and this whole natural gas pipeline issue is not going away. So what do people do at this point?
So there will be an opportunity to have a number of what are called public statement hearings where Westchester residents can stand up and talk about their story, because that's the most powerful way to talk about an individual's experience with the cost of energy. And they'll also have a chance to reach out to their politicians and say, I want you to advocate for me, both in these public statement hearings, but also in front of the state's regulator, the Public Service Commission. If there's any number of groups and municipalities should get involved in the rate case as parties. It's not that hard to become a party. Westchester is very good at it, and they have some experts that work for the county. The municipality should look at that too, because they're the ones best suited to advocate locally for the people that live in their borders. And so those things, and then there'll be more public hearings later in the year, about 6 or 8 months from now.
Okay, and where do people get their information? How do they find out about events, about contact info? How do they get that?
So it'll be in the newspapers. It'll also be on the website of the Public Service Commission.
I wouldn't count on being in
Not
newspapers.
The newspapers. They're fading fast.
I think we need other ways. I think we need other ways to reach people.
I dated myself.
So where is it?
So it'll be on our Facebook page. It'll be on the company's website. It'll be on your elected officials' websites, and maybe it'll be on the radio too. And
your website again is
utilityproject.org, utilityproject.org. And, of course, you can call our 800 number, 877-669-2572. And, you know, we help low-income and moderate-income people with utility problems, and we'll also know when the hearings are.
I got a question for you.
Sure.
Since you're talking about politicians and their level of involvement, where does Latimer stand on any of this? Are you aware of what his stance is, what the county stance is?
So I haven't talked to him about this case, but I had the pleasure of working in the Senate with former Senator Latimer, now county executive. He is very much about, fighting for the common person, and so he'll be strong on affordability in Westchester. What shape that'll take, I think, is going to add up to what's in the best interest of the county as a whole. But I think he's on the side of the average person in the street in Westchester. I'd like to think he's demonstrated that already, but we'll get a chance to see some more in the next 8 to 10 months.
Well, thank you very much for that. We're just going to change subjects and pivot. Thank you very much for being on the show, Mr. Berkely.
Thank you, Ed Berry, too.
And Ed Berry, thank you very much. The smaller the berry, the sweeter it is. Anyway, Ardina, who do we have on next week?
Well, we're either going to have a show which will be post-game about whether you should have your son play football, or on the other side, what's happening in Venezuela. If we have, I'm not sure we have a Venezuelan community in Westchester County, but I'm going to find out.
Portchester has one.
Well, I'm going to find out, and how this whole debacle is impacting.
You know, 2 weeks from today, those magical words will be heard.
Pitchers and catchers report.
So if we could get a baseball-centric show going, now, John, you know people.
Okay, I promise you a baseball-centric show.
Okay. Anyway, everybody, you have a great week, and stay out of the cold, stay inside, and go Rams. Beat those Patriots.
Yes.
Bye now.